Imagine a fighter jet that doesn't roar across the sky, it glides, almost silently, while pulling maneuvers so sharp that traditional aircraft would rip apart midair. Now imagine that same jet consuming a fraction of the fuel, producing almost no heat signature and confusing radar systems designed by the world's most advanced militaries. Sounds like science fiction, right? Well, what if I told you it's real? Welcome to a new chapter in aviation, one that almost no one saw coming. Because this story doesn't begin in the US, Russia, or China. It begins in Africa. And at the center of it all is a man who has repeatedly disrupted the rules of engineering, Maxwell Chikumbutso. In today's video, we're diving into the fighter jet that aerospace analysts are calling the aircraft that challenges physics, and why major defense contractors are quietly taking notes. But first, let's set the stage. For over a century, aviation has been built on a few non-negotiable principles. More thrust equals more fuel, more maneuverability requires more aerodynamic compromise, and more stealth demands trade-offs in performance. Maxwell's design does not seem to care about any of these rules. When footage of the prototype surfaced, experts initially assumed it must be CGI. The silhouette didn't match any known airframe. The control surfaces were minimal, and the propulsion system wasn't clearly visible at all. The first clue that something was off came from a retired aerospace engineer who analyzed the flight behavior. He noted that the jet accelerated without a visible afterburner flare and without the characteristic heat bloom detected on most conventional fighters. That immediately raised a question. If this thing isn't using standard turbofan engines, what is it using? Maxwell's camp has been careful with details, but insiders claim the jet incorporates an advanced hybrid propulsion system, part electromagnetic, part combustion. If that's true, the implications are enormous. Electromagnetic propulsion reduces heat signatures, improves efficiency, and potentially allows short-burst maneuvers that traditional aerodynamics can't fully explain. Suddenly, military strategists were paying attention. The second shock came from a brief demonstration of maneuverability. In the footage, Maxwell's jet performed a vertical climb, then a near-instant lateral shift that stunned observers. That kind of motion breaks the expectations of inertia associated with fighter aircraft. Normally, only drones with vectored thrust or reaction control systems can make such abrupt corrections. But here, we were watching a full-size jet do it. If you're wondering why that matters, consider this. Modern dogfights are no longer about who can go fastest, they're about who can change direction first. If Maxwell's jet can outmaneuver legacy fighters without sacrificing stealth, it doesn't just compete with modern jets, it leapfrogs them. But technology alone doesn't spark global interest. The geopolitical implications do. Because the world's leading aviation superpowers, especially the US and China, invest billions into fighters like the F-35, J-20, and Su-57. They operate under the assumption that they control the cutting edge of air warfare. The emergence of a prototype from Africa that challenges these assumptions is uncomfortable, to say the least. And that brings us to the part of the story that no one wants to talk about, the silence. Outside of small defense circles and independent researchers, mainstream aviation outlets have avoided the subject. Not because they don't know about it, but because they don't know how to categorize it. If the technology is real, it redefines what countries without massive defense budgets are capable of. Behind closed doors, aerospace engineers are asking questions like, how is this powered? Where is the heat signature? What's the fuel source? What control surfaces are managing these maneuvers? These are not the kinds of questions that get asked about hoaxes. These are the kinds of questions that get asked when people find something they can't explain. But while governments speculate, Maxwell's own team frames this differently. According to people close to the project, the goal is not military escalation, it's mobility, logistics, and innovation. They describe it as a platform for the future, high-efficiency propulsion that could apply to cargo aircraft, commercial jets, even space launch systems. And if that sounds ambitious, that's because it is. Because Maxwell is not just working on jets. His innovations span electric vehicles, RF energy systems, marine transport, and now, if this footage is to be believed, next-gen aerospace. But perhaps the most controversial piece of this puzzle is what happened next. Shortly after the prototype demonstration, analysts began documenting technical patterns, unusual cooling systems, unconventional intake geometry, and sensor arrays that looked nothing like Western avionics. While the world argued about authenticity, one group stayed quiet: the people who design aircraft for a living. Because they know something very specific. Physics doesn't get broken. Physics gets upgraded. And in this case, Maxwell seems to have found a loophole that mainstream aerospace has overlooked for decades. The question now is simple: who will acknowledge it first? Defense contractors? Governments? Or the public? As the prototype footage circulated in niche aviation forums, a few eagle-eyed observers noticed something even more intriguing than the flight performance. The aircraft wasn't taking off from a conventional military runway. It appeared to launch from a compact strip with minimal ground infrastructure. That suggests two very important things. The jet either requires extremely short takeoff capability, or it possesses assisted propulsion that negates the need for long acceleration runs. For military planners, that detail alone is a game changer. Modern air forces rely heavily on massive airbases, easy targets in a conflict. A fighter jet that can operate from improvised locations, without heavy logistical support, completely rewrites defense strategy. Suddenly, smaller nations with limited infrastructure could field advanced air assets without building billion-dollar airbases. And that realization triggered the first quiet inquiries. Within weeks, Maxwell's team reportedly received visits from aerospace delegations, some official, some posing as private engineering consultants. Their intentions weren't hard to guess. Whoever controls this propulsion technology doesn't just get a new jet, they get leverage. But Maxwell has been here before. He knows what happens when disruptive tech meets global power structures. His energy projects sparked foreign attention. His EV prototypes drew silent offers. Now, with aerospace on the table, the pressure is magnified. And so far, his response has been consistent: controlled disclosure, not open commercialization. One engineer embedded in the project leaked a detail that caused a ripple in systems analysis circles. He claimed that the jet's propulsion unit uses field-assisted thrust modulation, a phrase that has no clear meaning in conventional aerospace literature. But in fringe physics communities, it hints at hybrid systems that reduce drag through controlled electromagnetic fields. If that's true, we're not just witnessing a new aircraft. We're witnessing a new chapter of propulsion science. Suddenly, videos surfaced comparing the mysterious jet to concept patents filed by defense agencies in the US and Europe, patents that explore manipulating airflow with plasmas or reducing radar cross-section via electromagnetic damping. These ideas have existed on paper for decades, but never in flying hardware. Until now. And while analysts debated propulsion, a different group noticed something else. The weapon's hardpoints, there were none. No pylons for missiles. No visible gun ports. No external mounts at all. That left two possibilities. Either Maxwell's jet is still unarmed, or it's designed for roles that don't require kinetic weapons. If it's the latter, that opens doors to reconnaissance, electronic warfare, or even stealth logistics. Modern conflict is no longer just about shooting. It's about disrupting radar, spoofing sensors, delivering payloads, or extracting assets with near-zero detectability. A jet with extremely low thermal signature and silent propulsion checks every box for that kind of mission. And that's when the discussion shifted from, is this real, to who would use it? Curiously, Maxwell has never aligned himself with military powers. In interviews, he emphasizes civilian breakthroughs, renewable energy, transportation, humanitarian logistics. So, why build a fighter jet at all? The answer may come from something he said years ago in a small interview. Technology shouldn't be limited by who can afford to build it. It should be led by who is willing to imagine it. To Maxwell, the jet might not be a weapon. It might be a demonstration, proof that advanced vehicles don't require trillion-dollar budgets or secret military labs. Proof that innovation doesn't belong to nations, it belongs to people who refuse to accept limits. And ironically, that philosophy is exactly what makes superpowers nervous. Because if Maxwell can build a next-generation aircraft without a defense contract, then what stops others? What happens when disruptive aerospace becomes decentralized? When propulsion systems aren't locked behind classified walls? When innovation becomes democratized? The answer is simple: the balance of power changes. And that possibility brings us to the most dramatic twist in this story, a twist that unfolded quietly, without press releases or media coverage. One of the world's largest aerospace corporations requested a private demonstration. Maxwell agreed. But what happened during that demonstration remains behind closed doors, except for one detail leaked by an anonymous observer. The representatives left not with skepticism, but with shock. Not because the jet performed the way they expected, but because it performed in ways they couldn't predict. After that private demonstration, internal memos began circulating inside aerospace circles. Engineers who never comment publicly started asking quiet questions on encrypted boards. What kind of onboard computing does this thing use? Is the propulsion electrically assisted? Was there any thermal bloom on climb out? These weren't questions of disbelief. These were questions from experts trying to decode what they just witnessed. Meanwhile, mainstream aviation media had no clue any of this was happening. To the public, Maxwell was just another eccentric inventor from Africa. But to people in the room that day, he represented something far more disruptive. A breakthrough that didn't come from DARPA, NASA, the Pentagon, or any of the usual power hubs, but from an unclassified workshop outside the traditional military-industrial pipeline. That alone made the jet a threat, not militarily, but structurally. Because aerospace has always been gate-kept. You need billion-dollar R&D budgets, classified clearances, and deep political alignment. Innovation is controlled, slow, and centralized. Maxwell's jet ignored every one of those rules. It was as if a chess player walked into the middle of a tournament and started playing a completely different game. The corporation that attended the demonstration sent a follow-up request, this time for a technical briefing. But Maxwell's team declined. Privately, one of his engineers explained why. They're not interested in partnership. They're interested in containment. Containment is the unspoken language of advanced tech. When governments or corporations see a disruptive innovation they can't control, their first instinct isn't adoption, it's isolation. File patents, classify research, silence engineers, stall funding, or absorb the inventor through acquisition. Maxwell understood that better than anyone. Instead of giving briefings, he shifted strategy. He began releasing small breadcrumb-like details, not enough to replicate the jet, but enough to prove it's real. Short-range test footage. A clipped spectrogram of audio recordings. Air density readings from onboard sensors. None of it showed the propulsion system directly, but collectively it made denial impossible for anyone with technical literacy. Suddenly, defense analysts, not journalists, were the ones talking about Maxwell. And the most fascinating part? They weren't asking, "Is this real?" anymore. They were asking, "What's the power source?" Because no conventional fuel could sustain the performance profiles in the leaked data. The energy curve suggested a hybrid cycle, possibly electric, possibly field-assisted, but definitely not chemical combustion alone. This is when Maxwell made his boldest move so far. He offered to let independent aerospace universities analyze non-classified output telemetry. Not the engine schematics, not the reactor, not the core propulsion, just the outputs. It was enough. If a dozen universities confirmed the flight data, the world would have no choice but to accept the reality of a paradigm shift. And that's when everything got complicated. Within days of sending out invitations, 2 universities backed out abruptly. No explanation, no public statement. A professor from one of them later told a colleague off-record that they were strongly advised to decline. That's not a coincidence, that's pressure. But instead of shutting down, the story took an even stranger turn. A small aerospace institute from Scandinavia accepted. Then another from Southeast Asia. Then a private research collective from South Africa. None of them were part of the EU defense ecosystem. And that matters, because it means the analysis would happen outside the traditional geopolitical choke points. While preparations quietly moved forward, the conversation among intelligence analysts shifted. Suddenly, they weren't discussing if the jet was military grade. They were discussing who might adopt it first. And the countries being mentioned weren't the typical superpowers. They were the countries who need asymmetric tools, nations who don't have $900 billion defense budgets, but who would leapfrog any advantage they could get. Maxwell's technology gave them something priceless: the ability to skip decades of aerospace development in one move. That's when a new question emerged, one more dangerous than all the others. What if Maxwell never intended to build a fighter jet at all? What if his real goal was to make the barrier to advanced aerospace collapse? Because once that barrier falls, once nations realize they don't need to wait for the West or China to develop future aviation, the entire global power structure changes. And that realization is exactly what triggered the next chapter of this story, one involving a foreign defense delegation, a sealed hangar, and a conversation that would decide whether this technology remains independent or becomes classified forever. The foreign delegation arrived quietly, without press, without military insignia, without the usual spectacle that follows international defense visits. Just 3 officials, a translator, and a sealed briefcase. They were escorted straight into the hangar, where the aircraft sat under dim overhead lights, sleek, matte, and silent. No markings, no tail numbers, no serials. A fighter jet that looked like it belonged to 2045, not the present day. The leader of the delegation spoke softly, almost cautiously, as he walked around the craft. "We did not come to purchase a weapon," he said. "We came to understand the principle." That line caught Maxwell's chief engineer off guard. Most governments would have opened with pricing, licensing, or strategic use cases. But this delegation wanted knowledge. Maxwell joined the conversation a few moments later. Not in a lab coat, not in a suit, just a plain shirt, clipboard, and that quiet, analytical stare he always had when dealing with people who underestimate him. The official gestured around the hangar. "If this jet truly operates outside conventional thermodynamics, then you are not selling a machine, you are selling a paradigm. And paradigms cannot be exported. They spread." That was the moment Maxwell realized why they had come. They weren't trying to buy the aircraft. They were trying to prevent a monopoly. If one power block, one corporation, or one military secured this technology in secret, the world would tilt overnight. But if multiple nations had insight into the principle, nobody could bury it. So the delegation made a proposal that stunned everyone in the hangar. They offered to fund an international research cooperative, neutral, multinational, with no military oversight, no classified restrictions, and no defense contractors. A scientific alliance focused solely on understanding the propulsion model. For the first time, Maxwell looked genuinely conflicted. Because while the idea sounded noble, it also meant something else. Attention. Bureaucracy. Politics. The exact ecosystem that kills breakthrough technologies. His hesitation didn't go unnoticed. The official opened the sealed briefcase. Inside wasn't money, wasn't a contract, wasn't a procurement form. It was something far more strategic, a list of sanctioned aerospace professors, engineers, and thermodynamic specialists willing to participate anonymously until the research was viable. It was a network, a pre-built infrastructure, a shadow scientific organization ready to activate the moment Maxwell agreed. But the real twist came next. The official lowered his voice and said, "Several major powers will try to classify you. Others will attempt to replicate you. One will attempt to discredit you. But none of them understand the danger of suppressing a paradigm shift." He paused, then added, "When aviation changes, geopolitics follows. When geopolitics shifts, history accelerates. And when history accelerates, the old powers lose control." That sentence echoed in the hangar long after he finished speaking. After the delegation left, Maxwell's team gathered in the control room. They debated for hours, not about military applications, not about money, but about ethics. If they partnered with nations, they risked militarization. If they partnered with corporations, they risked monopolization. If they partnered with no one, they risked disappearance. And then one of Maxwell's youngest researchers, barely 24, asked a question that silenced the room. "What if we don't partner with anyone? What if we publish?" The idea sounded insane at first. Publishing propulsion data is not like releasing open-source software. This wasn't code, it was power. The kind of power that could redefine air superiority, energy logistics, and global mobility. But it was also the only guaranteed way to prevent containment. If even 1% of the knowledge escaped into public academia, suppression would fail. Governments can classify documents. Corporations can buy patents. But nobody can unpublish physics once it enters the scientific bloodstream. The more they talked, the more the idea gained momentum. Not a full release, not the reactor, not the control systems, but the theoretical framework. Enough to validate the phenomenon. Enough to let universities study it openly. Enough to force the aerospace community to confront it. And just as they were reaching consensus, something unexpected happened. The hangar lights flickered, and an alarm indicator flashed across the security console. Someone had breached the building's external network perimeter, not physically, but digitally. A remote intrusion probing for telemetry files, propulsion logs, environmental data, and video archives. It wasn't a petty hacker. This was structured, surgical, and coordinated. Maxwell walked over to the console, scanned the logs, and frowned. The data packets weren't coming from a random IP block. They were coming from a classified domain associated with a Western defense network. They weren't trying to delete his data. They were trying to copy it. The race had already begun. The intrusion attempt lasted only 17 seconds before the security system forced a disconnect, but that was enough. Enough to confirm the delegation's warning wasn't theoretical. Enough to prove multiple powers were already moving behind the scenes. Maxwell didn't panic. He didn't shout. He just exhaled slowly and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. They're not going to wait. So neither can we. Within hours, the strategy shifted. The team broke into 3 groups. The first group secured the propulsion telemetry, encrypting it in isolated hardware modules, disconnected from any network. The second group drafted a partial theoretical paper, stripped of classified schematics, but rich enough in mathematics to draw academic attention. The third group prepared for something entirely different, a demonstration flight. Because publications can be ignored. Papers can be discredited. Simulations can be dismissed. But a machine in the air doing what no jet has ever done? That can't be argued with. The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. A silent vertical takeoff, a cruising maneuver at Mach speeds without heat signatures, and a multi-hour endurance loop powered without traditional combustion or batteries. The military had tried to classify such capabilities generationally. Maxwell was about to live stream one. The risk wasn't the flight. The risk was the signal. If they transmitted telemetry publicly, every intelligence agency would log the raw data. If they didn't, skeptics would scream CGI, hoax, or experimental editing. So Maxwell made a brutal decision. No telemetry, no special effects, no editing, just multiple independent camera feeds filming from the ground up, each recorded on physical tapes with no external network connection. While the hangar prepared for dawn, word of the planned demonstration leaked. Not to the public, not to academics, but to defense watchers, aviation insiders, radar hobbyists, the quiet online communities who monitor transponders, satellites, and airspace anomalies for fun. And that's where the real wildfire started. Late that night, in a private aerospace forum, a user posted, "Unscheduled test flight registered in Southern Africa. No transponder. Military-grade radar signature, but no heat plume. Possibly ballistic." Replies exploded instantly. Impossible. No jet has zero thermal trace at Mach speeds. Could be classified UAV. Could be spoofing. Where's the launch site? Nobody knew. Nobody could confirm. But they stayed awake watching the satellite feeds anyway. Meanwhile, in the hangar, the jet was rolled out to the runway. The craft didn't roar. It didn't rumble. It didn't scream like a fighter. It hummed like a high-voltage transformer wrapped in velvet. Engineers strapped on headsets. Cameras rolled. Maxwell stood with one hand on the fuselage, eyes closed, listening to the vibration like a musician tuning an instrument. Then he stepped back, raised his hand, and gave a simple command. Lift. No countdown. No theatrics. The aircraft rose, straight up, without tilting forward, without afterburners, without visible thrust. Just clean, silent levitation against the night sky. The ground crew stared. Some forgot to breathe. Vertical lift isn't new. VTOL jets exist, but they don't lift like this. They fight gravity with brute force. This machine ignored gravity like it was optional. At 600 feet, the nose tilted eastward and the jet accelerated. No flame trail, no sonic crack, no visible shockwave. It just became a streak of motion and vanished into the upper atmosphere. A few minutes later, radar hobbyists started posting screenshots. Object at 80,000 feet, no thermal wake. Climbing rapidly. What the hell is this? And then something unprecedented happened. Satellites tracking infrared signatures failed to register it entirely. In certain circles, that was the equivalent of a building disappearing from Google Maps in real time. Inside the hangar, the flight monitors showed nothing but a blinking altitude marker and a soft, stable power reading. Then the comms channel crackled to life. Cruise achieved. Power at 32%. No thermal spike. No EM interference. Holding trajectory. If anyone outside the building heard that, flight physics textbooks would need a rewrite. But the most surreal moment came 16 minutes later, when the jet re-entered visible range above the runway and dropped from stratospheric altitude to ground level, not in a violent dive, but in a smooth, controlled vertical descent, like it was riding invisible rails. When the landing gear touched down, the engineers didn't cheer. They just stared at the craft, at each other, and at the implications. The sky wasn't conquered, it was redefined. And before anyone could react, Maxwell spoke. That's enough silence. Now, let's make noise. The intrusion attempt lasted only 17 seconds before the security system forced a disconnect, but that was enough. Enough to confirm the delegation's warning wasn't theoretical. Enough to prove multiple powers were already moving behind the scenes. Maxwell didn't panic. He didn't shout. He just exhaled slowly and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. They're not going to wait. So neither can we. Within hours, the strategy shifted. The team broke into 3 groups. The first group secured the propulsion telemetry, encrypting it in isolated hardware modules, disconnected from any network. The second group drafted a partial theoretical paper, stripped of classified schematics, but rich enough in mathematics to draw academic attention. The third group prepared for something entirely different, a demonstration flight. Because publications can be ignored. Papers can be discredited. Simulations can be dismissed. But a machine in the air doing what no jet has ever done? That can't be argued with. The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. A silent vertical takeoff, a cruising maneuver at Mach speeds without heat signatures, and a multi-hour endurance loop powered without traditional combustion or batteries. The military had tried to classify such capabilities generationally. Maxwell was about to live stream one. The risk wasn't the flight. The risk was the signal. If they transmitted telemetry publicly, every intelligence agency would log the raw data. If they didn't, skeptics would scream CGI hoax or experimental editing. So Maxwell made a brutal decision. No telemetry, no special effects, no editing, just multiple independent camera feeds filming from the ground up, each recorded on physical tapes with no external network connection. While the hangar prepared for dawn, word of the planned demonstration leaked. Not to the public, not to academics, but to defense watchers, aviation insiders, radar hobbyists, the quiet online communities who monitor transponders, satellites, and airspace anomalies for fun. And that's where the real wildfire started. Late that night, in a private aerospace forum, a user posted, "Unscheduled test flight registered in Southern Africa. No transponder. Military-grade radar signature, but no heat plume. Possibly ballistic." Replies exploded instantly. Impossible. No jet has zero thermal trace at Mach speeds.